The wind had a voice that morning. It wasn't loud, just steady, a low whisper through the dry grass, brushing across the bare, cracked land like an old lullaby meant for the dead. Eli McCall stood at the edge of his ranch, boots planted, in the brittle dirt, calloused hands wrapped around a weather-worn shovel. His coat flapped against his legs like a worn-out flag. The sun had barely cracked the horizon, but the sky was already stained with cold gold, the kind of light that belonged more to endings than beginnings. He had started digging before dawn. The earth was hard from drought and frost, and each thrust of the shovel sent shocks up his arms. His body was too old for this kind of labor, but that was the point. He didn't want it to be easy. He wanted to feel it, bone deep, every ache, every breath. It was the first thing he had felt in a long while. Eli had lived alone on this ranch for nearly 20 years. After his wife died in childbirth, and the child didn't last the winter, the house that once rang with love grew silent. His day became routine, feeding what few chickens remained, patching fences that didn't need fixing, watching the sky for weather that never changed. The land was empty, and so was he. He hadn't told anyone of his decision. There was no one to tell. No neighbors within 10 miles. No letters sent or received. Even the preacher who used to make rounds had stopped visiting after Eli met him once at the gate with a rifle across his lap. The world had moved on. Only Eli hadn't. As he dug, his breath rose in visible clouds. The wind tugged at his hat, and somewhere a hawk cried overhead, circling, as if waiting. The irony didn't escape him. The grave he was digging wasn't for an animal, it wasn't for a lost loved one. It was for himself. He had chosen this spot carefully. Under the old cottonwood tree, near the split-rail fence, where the grass grew slightly taller and the soil was softest in spring. He remembered planting wildflowers there once, before he stopped caring whether things bloomed or not. This was where he would lie down one last time, where the pain could be buried, along with the silence. The act of digging became a rhythm, one that silenced the noise in his head, the doubts, the guilt, the flickers of hope he'd long since trained himself to kill off. He paused only once, standing upright to wipe the sweat from his brow. The sun had risen a bit more now, casting long shadows that made the hole appear deeper than it was. He looked down into it and saw nothing but dirt, and maybe that was fitting. A life that began in dust, ending in dust. He didn't cry. He had no more tears to give. The ground beneath him, like the life behind him, was dry. And then, through that wind, a sound. Faint, sharp, out of place. Eli froze. He gripped the shovel tightly, eyes narrowing toward the distant edge of the fence line. For a moment, he thought it might be his mind playing tricks again, the kind of noises that come when you've been alone too long. But then he heard it. Again, a thud, a groan, then silence. Setting the shovel aside, Eli walked toward the gate, slowly at first. The gate hadn't creaked in weeks. No visitors, no cattle, no reason. But there it was now, slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. And there, just beyond it, lay something, someone curled on the ground. A figure, a girl. Eli's heart kicked like a mule in his chest as he stepped forward. The body on the ground was slight, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her dark hair, tangled and dust-covered. One hand clutched her swollen belly. Her face was turned to the sky, eyes fluttering as if caught between sleep and faint. Eli knelt beside her, and in that moment, everything he had planned, everything he had accepted, came to a halt. The hole behind him remained, but the man who had dug it was no longer sure what it was for. Eli's fingers trembled as he reached for the girl's wrist, searching for a pulse. For a second, he feared he was too late, but then, faintly, he felt it, a slow, irregular thump beneath her cold skin. Relief surged through him, strange and unwelcome. He hadn't felt responsible for anyone in years. He stared down at her face, pale beneath the dirt, lips cracked, eyes fluttering like wings too weak to lift. She couldn't be more than 20, and her body told a desperate story, swollen with child, gaunt from starvation, bruises along her arms, like rings on a tree marking every hardship she'd endured. He didn't ask himself what to do. Some long-buried instinct moved him. Gently, he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her off the ground. She weighed nothing. The wind caught her shawl and revealed even more bruises along her ribs. Eli turned his face away from the sight and carried her past the gate, past a half-dug grave, and into the house he hadn't welcomed a soul into. For over a decade, the door creaked on its hinges as he nudged it open with his boot. Inside, it was dim, cold, and bare. Dust lay on everything, the shelves, the single chair, the hearth that hadn't seen fire in weeks. But Eli made straight for the small cot in the corner, the one he used to sleep on before he gave up caring about comfort. He laid the girl down gently, adjusting the old blanket over her shivering body. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what came next. It had been years since he'd seen a woman, much less helped one. Her presence was already altering the stillness he had built around himself like armor, but he couldn't let her die. Not here, not when he still had breath in him. He rummaged through an old cabinet and found a tin of boiled oats, long past fresh but still edible. He stirred some water from the barrel outside into a pan and placed it over the stove. striking a match with hands he didn't realize were shaking. The hiss of flames startled him. The last time he'd used the stove was a winter 3 years ago, when a coyote had broken into the chicken coop and he'd needed something hot to stay sane. Once the porridge was ready, he filled a spoon and moved back to the girl. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, dark and deep, filled with pain, then closed again. He dipped the spoon carefully between her lips, coaxing her to swallow. She choked at first, but then drank greedily, her throat working. With desperate need, bit by bit, he fed her until she drifted into a fevered sleep. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the hours passed. Eli sat by the bed, watching her chest rise and fall, wondering who she was and where she had come from. Her clothes, tattered and handmade, told him little, but the pattern of beads on her shawl stirred a faint memory. Apache, he hadn't seen their kind in years. Not since the treaty, not since the violence. He stared at her round belly, rising with each breath, and something clenched in his gut. She was alone, far too young, and pregnant. Whatever journey had brought her here, it had nearly killed her, and it might still. Eli leaned back in the creaking chair and looked toward the door. The shovel still lay where he had dropped it. The grave still yawned beneath the cottonwood tree. But now, something had shifted. The girl's presence, fragile as a whisper, had disturbed the silence he had buried himself in. She had collapsed at his gate like an angel who'd fallen out of the sky, and suddenly, his plans for death didn't seem so certain. For the first time in years, Eli McCall prayed. Not out loud, not in any structured way, but deep within. A simple plea to whatever power still looked down on forgotten men and broken women. Let her live, he thought. Let her stay. The night came quietly, as it always did, on the edge of nowhere. The prairie winds softened into whispers, brushing against the creaking boards of Eli's cabin. Inside, the flickering fire he'd built with stiff fingers threw long shadows across the walls, illuminating a room that hadn't felt alive in years. The girl, still unconscious, her breath thin but steady, lay bundled beneath the warmest blanket Eli had left. Her face had regained a bit of color, though her forehead burned with fever. She murmured now and then, fragments of language Eli couldn't understand, whispers of pain and names he didn't recognize. He stayed close but kept his distance, unsure whether to comfort or simply guard her. He hadn't lit that fire in months, not since the last winter storm. Now, it burned steady and bright, as though the cabin itself had awoken. Sensing someone worth saving had crossed its threshold, Eli sat beside the hearth, watching the flames dance. His hands were rough and blistered from digging, earlier that day, a grave that now mocked him from beyond the window. He didn't know what kept him tethered to this world anymore, not until this girl had fallen into it. He thought about the rifle leaning in the corner. He'd kept it loaded all these years out of habit, not hope. The world had taught him long ago that trust was a fool's luxury. He'd seen men smile while holding knives behind their backs, and women cry while stealing what little he had. But this girl, she hadn't begged, she hadn't spoken, she had collapsed, as if her body had no more strength to lie, and somehow, that made her more honest than anyone he'd met in decades. Her belly moved slightly with each breath, the unborn child within her silent and still. Eli had never been a father, he'd never even imagined it. The war had taken his youth, and the silence afterward had swallowed the rest. Now he found himself watching over two souls, one he didn't know, and another not even born. He couldn't help but wonder where the father was. Had he abandoned her? Died? Was he out there searching, frantic and afraid? Or worse, was he the reason she was covered in bruises? The fire popped, and Eli jolted. He rubbed his temples. He hadn't slept properly in days. His body still ached from digging the hole, the one meant for him. He'd planned to climb in before sunrise, let the cold finish what the loneliness had started. But now, there was something in that room that had interrupted Death's schedule. He stood and stepped outside, the cold air clearing his head. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the moon, silver and silent. His boots crunched softly against frost-touched dirt. He glanced toward the grave, still open under the cottonwood tree. The wind stirred the dry leaves above it, almost as if the land itself was sighing. Eli picked up the shovel and, without thinking, began filling it back in. Each scoop of dirt was a strange sort of defiance, not against death exactly, but against giving up. By the time he finished, his back was screaming, but his chest felt strangely lighter. He looked up at the sky. Stars blinked down like 1,000 quiet witnesses. Inside, the girl stirred again. Eli returned and checked her forehead, still burning. He soaked a cloth in cool water and dabbed it gently across her brow. She flinched, then settled. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she whispered a word in English. Please. Just that. A breath, barely formed, but it cut deeper than any cry for help. Eli leaned closer, heart thudding. He didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He only watched her, his thoughts loud in the silence. She was someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister. She was carrying life, barely holding on to her own. And somehow, she'd ended up at his door, not the neighbor's ranch a few miles north. Not the trading post down the creek, but his Eli McCall, the man who had vanished from the world. The man who had dug a grave with his own name in mind. He didn't know what it meant. But something inside him, that long-dead flicker of hope, stirred. Maybe, just maybe, this girl hadn't stumbled onto death's doorstep. Maybe she'd brought something with her. By morning, the fever had broken, but just barely. The girl opened her eyes for the first time in Eli's presence. And the look she gave him wasn't fear, but confusion, like she'd awakened in a place her memory hadn't caught up to yet. Her lips were dry, cracked, and when she tried to sit up, a moan of pain escaped her. Eli was at her side in 2 steps, a hand up, not to touch her. Not yet. Just to show her she wasn't alone. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You're safe." Her eyes locked onto his dark, wide, rimmed with fatigue and suspicion, but she didn't recoil. That was something. She blinked slowly, then whispered something under her breath, the syllables too soft to catch. Eli leaned closer. "What did you say?" She licked her lips and tried again. "Rain, ... Eli frowned, not understanding. "It's my name," she said, almost ashamed. Renin de Chessy sat back, the weight of her words settling in. Not just a name, a story. Names like that carried history, meanings born from ritual or grief or hope. He had no right to ask what hers meant. Not yet, maybe not ever. But he nodded once, slow and respectful. "I'm Eli." That was all he offered. No last name, no explanations. Just a quiet truth in a quiet room. Rain tried to shift again, but her body betrayed her. She winced, clutching her side. Eli moved a water basin to her lips. She drank, slowly, carefully. He didn't press her. Let her come to him in her own time. After all, he knew something about silence. And he knew pain even better. She looked around the room, her gaze resting on the stone fireplace, the patched walls, the old rocking chair in the corner. Then she looked at him. "Why did you help me?" He didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. "You fell," he said simply. "I was there." She stared at him, as if trying to decide whether that was a lie. But then her eyes softened. "Most men wouldn't." Eli shrugged. "Most men ain't got much else to do these days." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It didn't last long. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, now noticeably rounded beneath the blanket. That was when Eli realized she hadn't asked about the child. Not once, as though she feared the answer even more than her own condition. "You hungry?" he asked, changing the subject before the air grew heavier than it already was. She nodded. He stood, moved toward the castern skillet he'd hung near the fire. There wasn't much. He lived on beans and jerky most days, but he managed to scrape together some eggs, a bit of smoked rabbit, and half a biscuit left from the day before. She ate slowly, with trembling fingers, but she finished it all. Eli cleaned up in silence. He noticed her watching him, eyes curious, unsure, but not scared. He was a mystery to her. A weathered man with a gun on the wall and sorrow in his shoulders, offering shelter with no questions asked. After a while, she spoke again. "I didn't mean to come here. I was running." "From what white men?" she said bluntly. "3 of them. One carried a red bandana. Another had a cross burned into his belt. I think he was the one who..." Her voice broke. She turned her head, ashamed, silent again. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. Rage, maybe pity, definitely, but mostly a deep, gnawing sense of how broken the world had become. He wanted to ask more, but he saw the way she curled inward, trying to make herself small, so instead, he said, "They ain't here now." Her eyes lifted. "But what if they come back?" Eli rose, walked to the corner, and pulled the rifle down from its place. "Then they'll have to get through me." It wasn't bravado, just a simple fact. Rain stared at him for a long moment. Something changed in her face, not gratitude, not yet, but recognition. That maybe, just maybe, she'd fallen into the hands of someone who had nothing left to lose and, therefore, everything to protect. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the wooden walls. But inside the cabin, something had settled. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Eli felt it. Not so felt, a kind of tension in the air, a shift in the stillness that had settled around his homestead like dust. He'd lived with the wind and silence for so long, he knew when something wasn't right. Even the birds had gone quiet. He stood on the porch with his rifle resting loosely against his side. Not in alarm, but in readiness. The old wood under his boots creaked as he stepped forward and scanned the horizon. That's when he saw them. First, just a blur of movement on the distant ridge, then shapes, shadows, riders, 1, then 3, then 10, then more. A long silent line emerging over the hill, like a wave cresting from another world. Eli's grip tightened on the stock of his rifle, but he didn't raise it, not yet. He didn't recognize their faces from this distance, but he recognized the posture. Warriors, and not the kind that wandered. These were scouts, organized, silent, purposeful. Within minutes, the land beyond his fence was covered in horses and riders, dozens of them, circling, positioning, waiting. Then more came, a second wave behind the first. In total, there had to be near 50, maybe more. all native, all watching his cabin. Watching him. Eli didn't move. He didn't step off the porch. And he didn't show fear. He just stood there weathered, wiry.com as a dry riverbed and waited. The screen door creaked open behind him. Rendashes stood barefoot, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, her hair tousled from sleep. When she saw the riders, her breath caught. They followed me, she whispered. Or maybe they came for the child. Eli glanced back at her. They friends of yours? She shook her head. I don't know. Could be from my father's people. Or from the ones who wanted me gone. You think they mean harm? She hesitated. I don't know what anyone means anymore. Eli nodded once, then handed her the rifle. She looked at him, confused. You're giving me your weapon. He moved past her and stepped inside, returning a moment later with a second rifle. I'm giving you a choice. You want to run? I won't stop you. You want to stand? Then stand beside me. Her fingers closed around the worn wood of the gun. She didn't speak, but she didn't run either. By now, the horses had stopped just beyond the gate. Dust settled behind their hooves like a rising fog. One rider dismounted, then another. They were silent, every movement deliberate. Then a third man dismounted, a tall, broad-shouldered warrior with gray streaks in his hair and the bearing of a chief. He stepped forward, alone, until he was just beyond the fence, eyes locked on Eli. You the one who took her in? The chief asked, voice low and gravelly. Eli didn't answer immediately. He wasn't one to waste words. Instead, he nodded. Was dying? Eli added after a beat. I gave her water, gave her shelter. The chief's eyes moved to Hunched, who stood now beside Eli on the porch, rifle resting across her arms but not pointed at anyone. When he saw her, the chief's entire posture changed. He exhaled, a long, slow breath. You don't know who she is, do you? Eli said nothing. She's the daughter of Fire and Blood, the chief continued. A war chief, killed last spring by white raiders. His only child vanished weeks ago. We thought she was taken, or worse. Eli's eyes flicked to Renin. She looked stunned, not at the news but at how many had come, how many still remembered her, how many had searched out. The chief stepped closer. You saved her, and the child of Fire in the Blood now grows in her womb. Renin the shits turned away, tears brimming in her eyes. Eli didn't move. The wind was rising again. Then what happens now? Eli asked. The chief looked at him and spoke words that would stay with him forever. Now, we protect the man who protected her. And just like that, the line between stranger and tribe was erased. That night, the sky over the prairie lit with fires, small ones at first, then larger, more permanent flames as the warriors made camp near the ranch. It wasn't an invasion. It felt more like a homecoming. But for Eli, it was a strange and almost overwhelming sight. His land, once silent and empty, was now alive with the sounds of horses, low chanting, and drums that pulsed like the heartbeat of an ancient earth. The night air carried the smell of burning sage, roasted meat, and stories older than any white man's map. Eli stood by the porch, watching the transformation. He hadn't invited them, but he hadn't turned them away either. That seemed to be enough. But Rainanashes sat on a blanket by the central fire, her face painted with ochre, and her long dark hair braided by two elder women. Her hands rested on her growing belly, and though she was silent, there was a calm to her, a sense of being seen, maybe for the first time in a long while. She was not just a runaway anymore. She was a daughter returned, a future mother, a legacy that would be guarded by more than just fences and guns. One of the warriors, a younger man with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, approached Eli with a wooden bowl of smoked venison. He offered it without a word. Eli accepted it with a nod. You're not afraid? The young man asked in a rare moment of shared language. Not of you, Eli replied, his voice gravelly. What are you afraid of? Eli looked toward the fire, where Rainanashes was laughing softly at something an elder said. Losing her, he said simply, and not knowing if I deserve to keep her. The young man gave a slow nod, then looked to the sky. She's not something to keep, she's something to protect. That's all we can do. Later, the chief tall elk invited Eli to sit with the council. At first, Eli refused. He didn't think of himself as part of anything larger than the broken gate he'd built, or the single shovel still half buried in the grave he'd once meant for himself. But Rainanashes rose from her place, walked to him without a word, and took his hand. And in doing so, she pulled him into the circle. They sat around the fire, and the stories began, of Fire in No Blood's bravery, of his death, of the betrayal that scattered their people and silenced their songs. But tonight, those songs returned, quietly, then stronger, carried by voices once silenced by grief. When the fire burned low, Tall Elk stood and looked directly at Eli. You do not belong to our people by blood, he said, but you are tied to us now. You stood between her and death, you gave shelter when the world gave her none. I didn't do it for thanks, Eli replied. Tall Elk smiled faintly. That's why you're worthy of it. They passed him a small bundle cloth wrapped around a carved pendant, a bear tooth etched with symbols of their clan. For protection, Tall Elk said, for the child, and for you. Eli took it, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of what it meant. Renin leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time, in what felt like years, Eli did not think about the grave behind the barn, nor the loneliness he had fed for so long. He thought only of the heartbeat he'd felt earlier through her belly, steady, alive. That night, as sleep settled over the camp and the prairie stars blinked above, Eli sat awake, holding the pendant in one hand and Renin's hand in the other. For the first time, he realized maybe the grave hadn't been meant for him at all. Maybe it had just been the place where his old life had ended, and a new one had begun. The next morning dawned differently. The wind was gentler, the sun warmer not in temperature, but in spirit. Eli rose before the others, as was his habit, and walked the land with a mind no longer haunted by endings, but full of questions about beginnings. His boots moved across the soil he'd once planned to vanish into, and now he was walking it with a deeper purpose, perhaps even a destiny he had never asked for, but could no longer ignore. The ashes was still asleep inside the cabin, her breathing steady, her presence, even in rest, seemed to fill the entire room with life. The medicine women had watched over her through the night, ensuring that her strength remained intact, and they had begun speaking to Eli less like a stranger and more like a man entrusted with something sacred. By midday, the warriors began packing up the camp, not to leave in anger or distance, but to let Eli and Renin begin their new life together without the heavy presence of ceremony and memory. Before they left, each warrior approached Eli and laid something down on his porcha-carved figure. A string of beads, a feather, a bone charms, small things with large meanings. To the untrained eye, it looked like clutter. To Eli, it was a quiet covenant. We were here, we saw, we honor you. Tall Elk was the last to approach. He held out a walking staff carved from white ash, the kind passed only to those chosen to walk to worlds. Keep her safe, he said. She is more than you understand. She carries more than blood. I will, Eli answered, his voice firmer now. I swear it. The chief's eyes met his. Then you are no longer alone. As the warriors rode off, their horses kicking up dust that glittered in the morning light, Renin stepped out onto the porch. She watched them with a mix of sadness and peace. I thought I had no one left. She whispered. You do now, Eli said, and so do I. For the next few weeks, their days found a rhythm neither had known before. Eli, once a creature of isolation, learned to speak in softer tones, to ask instead of assume, and to make space for someone other than himself. Renin, once hunted and broken, found strength in small things, gathering herbs behind the barn, painting symbols on the baby's blanket, and singing to the belly that grew rounder with each dawn. One evening, she brought out a scrap of cloth and handed it to Eli. On it was an embroidered pattern, a circle within a sunburst, surrounded by 4 rivers. It's his name, she said, or hers, I won't know yet, but they'll carry this pattern always. It means born of storm and fire, but kept by the earth. Eli ran his fingers over the stitching. You made this for the child. She nodded. For our child. The words landed like an arrow through his chest, sharp, not in pain, but in truth. He had been digging his own grave because he thought no one would ever need him again. Now, there would be a child, a family, a future. And not just his future, but a future born from 2 worlds that once feared each other. That night, Renin began to feel pain's early signs. The old women had said that the child was not far off. She didn't cry out or panic. She simply took Eli's hand and placed it over her stomach. He's coming soon, she whispered, and I want you to be the first to hold him. Eli nodded, overwhelmed but resolute. Then I will. And as the stars bloomed in the sky again, Eli sat by the fire, the carved staff beside him, the embroidered cloth in his lap, and Renin resting with her head on his leg. He didn't know what the next few days would bring: labor, pain, maybe fear, but he wasn't digging a grave anymore. He was building a cradle. The wind howled through the midnight trees as if mourning and celebrating all at once. Inside the small cabin, lit only by the flickering glow of the hearth, Eli knelt beside Renin. Her body was trembling from the waves of pain. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her fingers clutched the edges of the blanket she had stitched weeks ago, the one bearing the symbol for the child she was now fighting to bring into the world. Eli had never heard a woman cry like that. He had never seen such strength wrapped in such agony. The old Apache medicine woman, Willow Avest, stood over them calmly, instructing Eli when to lift, when to press the warm cloth to Rain's back, when to whisper. Speak not to ease her, she said, but to remind her she is not alone. And he'd in murmuring the name she had told him, repeating it over and over like a promise. Our child is almost here. You're not alone. I'm right here. Hours passed. Outside, the land stood silent. Even the coyotes had gone quiet, as if the world understood that something sacred was taking place inside that modest cabin. Just before dawn, a cry pierced the silence. Sharp, fragile, alive. Eli froze, breath caught in his chest. Renin was crying now too, but not in pain. In release, in joy, the medicine woman gently swaddled the small, red infant and placed the baby into Rain's arms. A boy, tiny, wriggling, and wailing as if shouting back at the stars themselves. Rain looked up at Eli and, with tears streaking her face, whispered, "Come, hold your son." He hesitated only a moment, just long enough to realize he was no longer the man who'd once dug his own grave. He stepped forward and took the child in his arms. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around one of Eli's thick, calloused ones, and a sob escaped the rancher's throat. He had held tools and weapons. He had gripped reins and lifted fence posts, but nothing had ever weighed as much or meant as much as that 7-pound child now in his arms. "I'll protect him," he said aloud. "I swear." Rain and Ashes, exhausted but glowing, smiled. "You already have." When the sun finally broke over the horizon, the first light spilled through the windows, catching on the feathers and beads still hanging from the rafters. The baby's cries settled, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Eli sat between Rain and the fire, cradling the boy while the medicine woman prepared a tea that would help the new mother recover. Later that day, hoofbeats sounded in the distance, not thundering, not aggressive, gentle, like a hymn on horseback. Eli stepped out onto the porch and saw riders approaching slowly, men and women from the tribe. Tall Elk was among them, his horse adorned with ceremonial paint. Behind him rode elders and children, each carrying something in their hands: baskets, pelts, dried meat, woven cloths, charms, and talismans. "We heard the child came at dawn," Tall Elk said, his voice low with reverence. Eli nodded. "A boy." The warriors dismounted and approached the porch one by one. Each laid their gifts at the steps, not for Eli, but for the child. They did not speak much. They did not shout or celebrate with fanfare. Instead, they sang softly, in their language, a song that sounded like the wind through pine and the hush of rain on stone. Rain and Ashes appeared in the doorway, the baby tucked in her arms. She said nothing as she stepped out, but the people of her blood bowed their heads when they saw her. Tall Elk spoke at last. "The child is one of both fires, one of earth and storm. He is the bridge." Eli looked to Rain, then back at the boy. "We haven't named him yet." Tall Elk nodded solemnly. "He will carry many names. Yours, hers, and one the land will give him in time." That evening, the tribe shared food, lit a ceremonial fire near the barn, and told stories under the stars. It was not a celebration for a single child, but for a future made possible by mercy, love, and the courage to open a gate instead of closing it. And as the fire burned low and the child slept in Eli's arms once more, the rancher looked up at the night sky, no longer a man waiting for death, but a father, a protector, and a soul reborn.